So she inspired this story, and I decided not just to tell her story, but to think about her story in terms of who her ancestors might have been and who her descendants might have been. So I came up with a novel with four girls. Each of them are 12 years old, living in different parts of the world at different times. Benvenida in 1492, Reina in 1923, Alegra in 1961, and Paloma in 2003. Bear with me. Okay, so Benvenida. So she's living in 1492, and you probably have heard a lot about 1492 and associate that with Columbus coming to the New World in 1492. But two other important things happened in 1492 that we need to know about. There was a battle against the Islamic, the Muslim community that was there, and Granada was surrendered to the Spanish Catholic king and queen at the time in early 1492. And it was in Granada that the King Isabella and King Fernando issued the Edict of Expulsion, which led to the expulsion of the Jewish community from Spain. This is what Granada still looks like today. So this Edict of Expulsion was essentially the process of forcing people to leave a place because the government of the time, the king and queen, decided they no longer wanted to have a diversity of religions. They just wanted one religion to exist in their kingdom, and that would be Catholicism. So Jews had to either convert to Catholicism if they wanted to stay in Spain, and if they didn't want to give up their religion, they were forced to leave and find another place to live where they could hold on to their Jewish faith. So you think about that. It was an amazing time, 1492. People had to make a decision. The Jewish community and individuals in the community had to decide, do we stay, do we convert so we can stay in our home, or do we leave our home and go somewhere else and start all over again so we continue to hold on to our Jewish religion and traditions. And so I discovered a chronicle from that time, which was really interesting, saying that as people were leaving Spain, particularly the women and the young people, they were singing and playing tambourines and timbrels to keep up their spirits. And I thought that was amazing that they left singing, and that inspired my work as well. And then I found this amazing artwork as well, showing women singing and playing timbrels and other instruments in that period, earlier in that period. And so my first character, Benvenida, is a poet, and this is very unusual at that time because very few girls can read and write, but her mother has taught her how to read and write. And this is one of her poems. I fear for all who hide their faith, do their tears burn as they fall down their cheeks. So this girl, Benvenida, is leaving Spain at the time with her parents, with her two brothers, but her cousin and her aunt and uncle, they're staying behind because they have decided to convert. And so she's thinking, what's the better decision here? Is it better to stay or to leave? And since she's a poet, she leaves a few words on a parchment and hides them in the wall of the courtyard of her house, hoping that perhaps maybe one day someone will find her words. And if not, at least her words will stay in Toledo, where she lives, in Toledo, Spain. And she talks about these marzipans, these almond flour and honey sweets that were very common at that time and that are still very common in the town of Toledo today in Spain. So she wonders about how cruel this journey has been, how difficult it has been to leave Spain. Would it have been better to have converted and stayed in Toledo? But she tries not to think that. She tries to think that it was wise to leave, even though they go through a lot of suffering when they leave Spain. And so from there we go to the next character, Reina, who's now living several hundred years later in Turkey in 1923, and she's a descendant of Benvenida. And she's living in this town called Silivri, near Istanbul in Turkey, which is where my grandmother lived. And this is a time when Turkey is becoming an independent nation in 1923. And that seems like a very positive thing, but the Jewish community at that time is very worried because they have continued to speak Spanish. So 500 years later, they're still speaking Spanish, and they're afraid that they're going to be forced to speak only Turkish and will have to give up their Spanish language and their traditions. So that's very important to them. And in case you've never seen what Ladino looks like, this is a newspaper from the late 19th century, and you can see it says La Época in Hebrew. So basically, this is what Ladino is. It's Hebrew letters, the Hebrew alphabet used to write Spanish. And so here you see the women played the oud at that time, as my grandmother did, women and girls. That was very common. And our character Reina gets into trouble with her father because she goes to a party and she plays the oud. Her mother has taught her to play the oud, and she sings a song. And it turns out that the party, there were supposed to be girls and boys, but there are only boys. And her father is very angry that she's gone to this party and sang this song about how in the sea there's a tower, in the tower a window, at the window a daughter who calls to the sailors. And she has sung this song to a group of boys, and he's very upset about that, and he has decided to marry her off to a man who's in Cuba, who's a few years older than her, and he will wait till she's 15 and he will marry her. So that is how Reina's story ends. And then the next girl, her daughter, Allegra, is now living in a different time and different time period and different place. She's living in Cuba in 1961, and she's living right by the harbor of Havana. This is exactly where my grandmother and my father also lived, in this area near the Havana harbor and on this exact street, Calle Oficios. And so our character Allegra is living here and living in a very different time. So in her time period, her father is a street peddler, like my uncle was here. And it's the time of the literacy campaign. It's a time after the Cuban Revolution. And so they're going around to the countryside to teach poor people, especially farmers, how to read and write because they don't know how to read and write. And so our character Allegra wants to be part of this literacy campaign. As you can see, lots of girls, young women participated in that time in the campaign, and she begs her mother to let her go, and talks about how there are hardly any schools outside of Havana. She's very idealistic and she wants to be part of this literacy campaign, and convinces her mother by telling her, if you couldn't read your sister's letters, because her sisters write to her from Turkey, just think how sad you would be. And so she wants to participate. And finally, her mother, Reina, allows her to participate in this literacy campaign. So off she goes. Her father is against it, but her mother lets her go. And she meets another girl there who is her neighbor in the building. And this girl is Afro-Cuban and has a different set of beliefs. She believes in this deity, the Virgin of Regla, who's also known as Yemaya. And they talk about their different religious faiths and how they still are religious. They still feel a religious belief, even though now they're part of a revolution that's trying to do away with religious practice. And here is the entrance to the synagogue that is later on built in Havana, the Jewish Community Center. And so she goes off to the countryside. She has a really good experience helping people to read and write. She gets to see the smallest hummingbird in the world, which only lives in Cuba. This is what it looks like, the sunsuncito. And so she really wants to stay in Cuba and be part of the revolution. But then her father gets into trouble with the revolutionary government, and she has to be sent to the United States. Her parents are supposedly going to come soon after, but they are delayed, and her mother looks at her with tears and is so sad because she's being sent away just like she herself was sent away from Turkey. And she ends up being part of a group of kids who leave from Cuba at this time on their own, and many of them are placed in orphanages as they wait for their parents to come and be reunited with them. And then the last girl, Paloma, is living in Miami in 2003. And she is Afro-Cuban on her dad's side and Sephardic Cuban on her mom's side. And at the beginning of her story, she's going to a memorial for this great salsa singer, Celia Cruz, who has just passed away. And they have a big memorial service for her at Miami's Freedom Tower. So she goes with her dad and learns from her dad about how he got into trouble for having music by Celia Cruz when he was still living in Cuba, because she was very against the government of the time of Fidel Castro, and he wore bell bottoms, which people weren't allowed to wear at that time. So he was sent to a camp, to a kind of jail, outdoor jail, until he was finally released. And then eventually he leaves Cuba. He converts to Judaism I mentioned Temple Moses, which is a Sephardic temple in Miami. And and so she's aware of that side of her story and promises herself that one day she's going to sing a song in Spanish, just like Celia Cruz. And she thinks about all the seas that have been crossed so that she could be alive today, all these different seas from different places that her ancestors have traveled. And when she talks to her abuela, her grandmother, who is Reina, Reina tells her about how her mother, her Paloma's great grandmother, used to say that she came from the city of Toledo because her last name was Toledano. So it seems possible that maybe she's from Toledo. And it just so happens that they are going on a trip to Spain. And so Paloma says, well, we have to visit Toledo and see if we have any ancestors there. And so at the end of the book starts in Toledo. And then at the end of the book, Paloma and her family go to the city of Toledo. And you have to read the book. And I know some of you have read the book to discover what happens and everything that Paloma learns about her ancestry. They go to this museum, the Sephardic Museum, the Museo Sephardi, which was once a 14th century synagogue, and unbelievably it's been preserved, and you can see the Hebrew inscriptions and everything on it. It's really an amazing thing to go there and to see it and to witness it. And there she learns that there is a parchment that is kept in the museum, and she understands the words of it. They're in Ladino, but very similar to Spanish, and it's the words of Benvenida, right? Who's writing how she was once welcome, but now is no longer, and where she will go tomorrow is a mystery of our God. And so she wonders if a young girl could have written those words, and she learns from Mariluz, who is the tour guide, that well, there weren't many people who could read and write at that time, but there were some who learned secretly, and that was true of Benvenida. And so here's Toledo today, and it's amazing that the old Jewish neighborhood is preserved. The Juderia, as they call it in Spain, is preserved very much the way it was back in the 15th century. And the story ends with Paloma gazing at the stars and wondering, what did her ancestors wish for? Is it similar to what she wishes for today? A home where we are welcome and where we can welcome others. So I'm going to end there to give us time. Oops.
Hear me right now if I talk, Ruth?
Yes.
Let me see. I'm trying to. Did I do this correctly? Not sure if I did this. Oh, here's the stop share. Got it. Okay. Got it. There it is.
Behar, can you hear me if I talk right now?
Yes.
Okay. Um, Thank you so much. I'm gonna just talk as loudly as I can. We're just gonna bounce around to the different rooms. So we're gonna start here at the JCC and ask them if they have any questions. Up next, we're gonna go to Bethel, and then after that, we're gonna go to Kahila. And it looks like there's 2 rooms at Bethel, so we're just gonna do it one at a time. We'll start here at the JCC. So who here at the JCC has a question?
Eliana, you want to go first?
Aiden's gonna ask the question.
Okay.
We're gonna start here, and then we're gonna go to Bethel next.
Okay, Eliana, you want to go first? Because
What was your favorite part to write?
what was your favorite part to write?
My favorite part to write. That's a really good question. I liked writing all the parts. As I wrote each part, I got excited about the story of each girl, but it was really exciting to write the 1492 part, just to imagine that far back, what life was like for kids, especially because we have so little information in the history books about what life was like for 11, 12-year-old kids. So I really enjoyed writing that part, but all the parts were exciting because then the next part was inspired by my grandmother. So I was trying to imagine her life. And then the third part was the part in Cuba, and I've spent a lot of time in Cuba, and I thought I was too little to have participated in something like the literacy campaign, but I always imagined what would it have been like to have gone to the countryside and tried to teach people how to read and write. So that was really exciting. I think the hardest one to write was the last one, because that was the story that would bring the whole book together. So how to do that and make it interesting was that was maybe the most challenging one to write. But I was really glad when it all came together because I always had this idea of four separate stories, and then figuring out how they would all tie together was kind of like, can I do this? So when it all came together, it was really exciting.
Great, let's go to Bethel. I saw Ronan Lapidus. Let's get your question.
It's wait. Okay, there.
Oh,
No. Okay.
You didn't first.
What was it like for you to come to America when you were speaking Spanish, and how did that help inspire your book? Or,
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was really hard at first. I know now you hear me speaking English and you think, well, what's the big deal? But I came speaking only Spanish. Actually, we had lived in Israel as well. We left Cuba, we went to Israel for a year, and then we came to New York. So I also spoke Hebrew at that time, but Spanish was what we spoke at home because that was, the language my parents spoke and my grandparents spoke. So I went to school, and back at that time, they didn't have programs like ESL, like English as a second language. They didn't have those programs yet. It was the 60s. And so I was just placed in a first grade classroom. And I couldn't speak, maybe I spoke a few words of English, but very basic. And so I couldn't understand. I could understand things that were going on, like if they put like a math problem on the board, 1 + 1 = 2. Like I knew the answer, but I didn't know how to say the number two. So it was really hard at first, and I was placed in kind of what we might call a remedial class, like a class of kids who were having trouble learning and so on. I was placed in a class like that. But one thing that happened is that in my class, there was a boy from Japan whose name was Shotaro, and he didn't speak English either. So we were both in this class, and we knew we were smart kids, but that we just didn't know the language. And so we were both like given all these tools to learn English, and I think we learned English so we could speak to each other because I couldn't speak Japanese and he couldn't speak Spanish. And so we were in this class together, and I always remember that. And I wrote an essay a long time ago called Learning English with Shotaro. So I think that was one of the ways that I learned English. And then once I learned it, which took a while, it took like 2 years or so. Once I learned it, then I kind of became a translator for my parents because in the end, kids learn languages a lot faster than adults do. So I was often translating for my mother when we'd go to the grocery store and picking things up and asking, "What's this? What's this cereal? What's this other thing?" So then I started becoming a translator, and I think that's what also eventually led me to want to be an anthropologist because anthropologists translate between cultures and languages.
Great question. Up next, we're gonna go to Kahila, and then we're gonna go back to Bethel. Ronan, you'll get a chance.
how did you decide to write in 4 different time periods?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know how it came to me, but I like the idea. Well, one book that was a big inspiration, I'm sure you've all read it, is Alan Gratz's book Refugee. Have you all read it? It's such an amazing book, and it's three characters in three time periods, and then they come together. And I just like that style so much of different stories coming together. And from the very beginning, like before I wrote a word of the book, I had an outline and I had the idea of the four characters, of the four girls. So somehow that was in my mind that these four girls would be the crux of my story. And I did wonder, I wondered, well, should I have more characters? Like, should I have more characters between Benvenida and Reina, like fill in the centuries a little more? But then I thought what would be interesting would be how do we connect to 1492? It's been 500 years since that happened. Do we have any connection to a past that's so, so, so far away from us? I mean, 500 years, that more than 500 years now, that's a really long time. So it's kind of like I wanted to ask myself, how do we connect to that faraway past? So I thought of the faraway past, 1492, and then those three time periods that would be like more or less close to the time that we're living in today, because 1923 is about 100 years ago. And then 1961 is not that long ago. 2003 is even closer. So I thought I'd look at time periods that were close to us and then one that was really far away and just try to imagine the lives of young people and Jewish Sephardic people in those times. So it just kind of became a challenge that I said for myself, could I tell a story this way? But the outline was there from the beginning, and I knew that the music would be important, that the oud, this instrument, the oud that I've talked about, would be important because my grandmother brought an oud with her from Turkey to Cuba, and she played the oud. Everybody always said she played the oud. And I thought that was so amazing. So I thought, the oud and the song and the music and poetry would connect all of those time periods.
Cool. All right, up next, we're gonna go back to Bethel, to the room that has not spoken yet, which is the Kitavav room.
We need to unmute.
We are.
Okay,
speak.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know how like Raina gets sent off to marry like a man she doesn't know? And then Raina's mother, or I guess parents, would have like a 20-year age gap. And so I was just wondering, like, did Raina's mother have to do the same thing? Um,
Yeah, that's a good question. At the time, it was very common in Turkey to have arranged marriages where your parents decided who you would marry, which of course we don't have today, but it still exists in many countries around the world. And so, yeah, so Reina's mother, her Mima, as she calls her mom is married to a man older than her, probably because her parents suggested it or thought that would be a good idea for her, or she could have fallen in love with a man who was older too. I left it kind of open what happened to Reina's mother, but I wanted the reader to know what happens to Reina and that it was common at that time for young girls, young women to be sent to Cuba and to other countries to marry men who were also from the same community and who promised them a better life than they had at home. But in this case, I decided that it would be a kind of punishment, like being sent to Cuba for her would be a punishment. She's 12 and the husband to be will wait 3 years to marry her when she is 15. And I know that seems extremely young, and it is extremely young, but I know people in the Sephardic Cuban community who got married really young at 15, 16, or 17 years old. So that part is actually true. So yeah, so with Reina, she's sent off to Cuba, and it's meant to be a punishment, but then she finds a way to survive that and to live a really long life and to have a really beautiful family. So even though it seems like it's like a very sad and tragic fate, she turns it around and actually turns it into a good fate. And then her husband turns out not to be such a bad guy in the end, but actually someone who really cared for her.
Thank you so much. We're gonna take another one here from Judea Reform. Yes.
what inspired you for your book?
So what inspired you for the book?
Yeah, a lot of things. I think mostly I wanted to try to imagine my grandmother a little bit, because I was very lucky to know my four grandparents. So I grew up with all four grandparents, the Ashkenazi side, the Sephardic side. I knew all four of them. And this grandmother, though, she was a little mysterious because, we knew about the oud, we knew that she sang songs, but other than that, she didn't talk a lot about herself because she went to Cuba and then she never saw her parents again. Many, many years later, after we had all moved to the United States, she saw her sisters. Her sisters came to visit, but she never saw her parents again after leaving Turkey and settling in Cuba as a very young woman, a young girl, really. And I thought, oh, what would that have been like to have left your parents behind and never have seen them? That was very common among a lot of the immigrants in that time, 100 years ago. But still, I thought, wow, that must have been really hard and painful. So that's kind of where I started. I started thinking about my grandmother, and then I thought, well, who could her ancestors have been? What does it mean to be Sephardic? We always associate Sephardic with 1492 because that's where the whole notion of being Sephardic comes from, that we are the Jews that left Spain because we didn't want to give up our religious faith. And so I thought, well, let me start the book in 1492 and then we'll jump forward to the present time. So that's what inspired me. I really wanted to sort of imagine my grandmother, not just in her personal life, but thinking about her in history, like going like way back and thinking about like who were her ancestors, who were my ancestors, thinking about that too. And then, who are her descendants? Like I'm one of her descendants. So kind of thinking about all of that, like going backwards in time and forward in time. That really was my inspiration and trying to honor her in some way, remember her and the heritage that she represents for me.
Great, right here.
That was very, yeah.
Okay, great. So now we are going, it's finally Rowan's turn.
He's going.
Rowan, it's your turn.
How long did it take you to write the book, and also how long were the readers blocks? Like, did you ever have that? Like, where you couldn't writers block?
Writer's block. Maybe there's too. Well, I should have checked to see how long it took me to write this book, but I started during the pandemic, right? So that was 2020. I think it took me like 2 years or so to write it. And then I made some revisions and changes to make it as good as it could be. So it took a little while. Let's see, the book came out last year, February 6, 2024. So it was done by February or March of 2023. Yeah, so it took me about a little bit more than 2 years, I would say, to write the book. Did I have writer's block? Sometimes I did. More than writer's block, I was just sometimes too busy to write because I'm also a professor. So there were times when I just didn't have enough energy to write because I was busy with my teaching, and I also do a lot of traveling and public speaking. And so I think what held me back sometimes was just not having enough time to write, but I always was always thinking about it. And then when I finally like zeroed in on it, I just really concentrated and got it done. So writer's block is something that every writer faces, and sometimes you have to put down what you're writing and write something else. Like I also write picture books. I have a picture book coming out probably not this year, but next year about Hanukkah. So I wrote a picture book. So sometimes you put what you're doing down if it's just hard, you're having just trouble moving forward with it. So you put it aside and you work on something else, and then you can come back to it. So I think that's what would happen with me, that I was also working on some picture books at the same time. And so when the novel got hard to keep writing, I would put it aside and work on something else and then be able to come back again with fresh eyes.
Great, Chris. Great, great question.
Actually,
Uh,
I should also add, sorry, I should also add that when I finished the first draft of the book, I really wanted to go back to Spain and go back to Toledo to go to the Sephardic Museum, see it again, like get re-inspired by it. So I did have that. I finished the whole book, went to Spain, and then came back and made some other like, finishing, polishing it up, some final touches after being like re-inspired by being in that space, which I found so amazing in Toledo. So let me add that as well.
That is wonderful. Looks like Bethel is getting ready to head out as well. Is there any last questions from Bethel before you guys have to go? And then we'll do a few more questions from the JCC and then move. Before you have to leave, anyone from Bethel, last chance?
Yeah, we've got a few. We might have to narrow it down to one or two.
What I want to, we hear all the questions, and then Ruth will do her best to answer them all.
So, my question was, you said that something about your mother or someone else's mother. I can't exactly remember, but I know. When did you get reunited with your mother, and how did?
Oh, yeah, no, that wasn't me. That's a character in the book. That's a character. Yeah, that's Allegra.
How did she, or did, wait,
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Fortunately, I wasn't separated from my mother or my father. We all left together from Cuba, but there were lots of people that had to leave separately because of visas and passports and just getting permission to leave the country was very difficult at that time. So a lot of people sent their kids out first, and then they came later. And in the book, it takes a while before Allegra is reunited with her mom. And so with Reina, because of the way things were then, things were very, very complicated, and it was very difficult to travel and to leave the country. So that's like a sad thing that happens to Allegra, that she's separated from her family, and then it takes a while. Her father ends up dying in Cuba, and then she's separated from her mother, who she reunites with a few years later. So yeah, that was very, very common, but fortunately I didn't have to go through that experience. And I think that
And we've got last questions from Bethel, and then we're gonna do questions from here in the JC. Why don't you just ask both questions, and then Ruth will answer them.
Which person out of the four that you wrote about could you relate personally most?
And then what's the second question?
Um, so do you think this book could have helped you when you were like 11 or 12, like, like after you went, to New York?
Yeah, thank you. Those are both great questions. So, the first question of the four, who do I relate to the most? I have to say that there's a piece of me in each of those girls. I don't think I could have written the book if I didn't feel that there was a piece of me in Benvenida with her. She was a poet, and I just think, oh, to be living in 1492 and be writing poetry is amazing. So I have a little piece of me in her. I have a little piece of me in Reina because I associate her with my grandmother, and my grandmother inspired that character. Allegra because she's so idealistic. I love that about her, that she's ready to go off and teach people how to read and write and live in the countryside. That's a part of me too, like the anthropologist in me. I've lived in the countryside in Spain, and so I also kind of recognize myself a little bit in Allegra. And then Paloma is the one that wants to understand all the history, like where do I come from, and like who are my ancestors. And I have that strong feeling also, so I also feel that connection very much to Paloma. So there's a piece of me in each character, and I think that's true that of a lot of writers, that we put ourselves into each of the characters that we write about. And then the second question was, would this book have helped me when I was 11 or 12? And yes, that's such a nice question. I think it really would have, to have had a book where there are Cuban Jewish, Sephardic Jewish characters, a young poet, a singer. I mean, all the things that are in this book are things that I would have loved to have known about when I was 11 or 12. So now I'm putting myself back at that age and imagining the books I would have liked to have read, and that hopefully all of you who are now this age will enjoy reading as well. So thank you.
Great questions from Bethel. Thank you so much. We've got maybe about 10-ish more minutes in here, so we've got a room full of kids here that I want to make sure they get a chance to ask their questions.
Can I get to ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. My question.
We're gonna go Isaac first, and then we'll go to the front of the room.
My question is, when you were writing the book, did you ever start tearing up?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So when you write a book, you get very emotional about it because you're feeling what your characters are feeling. And I was feeling very emotional at different moments of the book, like thinking about the expulsion from Spain, like just that idea of having to leave your country because you have a religion that they don't want to have in their country anymore. Just thinking, what was that like? And what was it like for families? And just imagining some people going, well, I'm just going to convert because I'll just practice my religion secretly. And that's what a lot of people did, is they stayed and they practiced the religion secretly. They appeared to be Catholic, but they were actually practicing Judaism in secret as well as they could. They often got into trouble for doing that. And so I thought, oh, that was so emotional for me to think about what that must have been like when people were living through that 500 years ago. And each character, like Reina, I felt so sad when, her father, well, if you read the book, you'll see her father stops talking to her and is so angry at her. And that made me definitely tear up. That's such a sad, sad thing. And then Allegra, who has such a joyous spirit. That's why she's called Allegra. But then she has to end up leaving Cuba. That also made me tear up a little bit. So each one, and Paloma kind of trying to figure things out. There's something so amazing about that. So definitely when people write books, when authors write books, we do get very emotional as we write the stories. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Did that you have to apologize?
I know.
Ruth, Isaac is saying the dad didn't even get a chance to apologize, and that makes him really sad.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, no, there's moments of sadness, and that's kind of what we do as writers is we kind of tap into our deepest emotions so that then when you read the book as a reader, you can tap into your emotions and think about issues that are really difficult, but that we have to think about. And I think that's one of the things that we do as writers, among other things. We also try to provide information about cultures and traditions you may not know about, but we also try to share our emotions and hopefully help others to face their emotions as well.
Got a lot of hands up here, so I'm gonna try to get to as many as I can. You're up.
Was it hard to find information and research about the Sephardic Jews?
Yeah, very nice question. Absolutely. It is not easy to find information, but there are some historians that have put together incredible information. There's a whole book about Chronicles of 1492. So Chronicles are like people that actually witnessed, that actually watched as Sephardic Jews like packed up their things and left Spain and went off to the different coasts to find a boat to leave Spain. So that was very moving when I found those documents and I could see like, oh, so they left singing. They were singing songs and bringing their timbrels and their tambourines with them. I thought that was so amazing. So I did find some really good information. I also found information about the Jews in Turkey and in Cuba, and I drew upon all of that. But there was also information that was missing, and that was also an inspiration to me because I couldn't find a lot of information about young people. What was it like to be 11 or 12 and living, say, in 1492? Like there was very, very little information. So that also was important to me because what I couldn't find in my research, I had to try to imagine in my fiction. So the two things came together, the research and my imagination.
I'm tired. I'm gonna call on you next.
How did you find our songs?
How did you find the songs?
How did I find the songs? I did some research on the songs too. I tried to find which were the older songs because a lot of songs are new. They're like 100 or 200 years old, so that's considered new. Those are relatively new. But to find the songs from a few hundred years ago was a little harder. So that took some research looking that up and finding there are fortunately lots of people who've written about the songs of the Sephardim. And then some of them I knew, some of them I had heard growing up or heard more recently. I've gone to a lot of concerts of Sephardic music and know a lot of people who sing Sephardic songs. There's been a lot of interest in the last few years in Sephardic music. So now you can find a lot of specialists in that field and you can find a lot of recordings of the music. If you're interested in the music, if you go to my website, there's a playlist with all the songs that are mentioned in the book, and you can hear and listen to the songs, sometimes in two or three different versions. Like the main song, En la mar hay una torre, En la mar hay una torre, that song, which is beautiful. That song is mentioned in the book, and then on my playlist on the website, you can listen to the songs so you can find out more about the songs. They're really, really beautiful.
Why did you decide to write that once Raina married the person she was arranged to, she stopped playing the ode?
Yeah, nice question. Well, basically, I did that because that's exactly what happened with my grandmother. That was the story that was always told to me that she played the oud, she sang songs, then she got married. She had four children, among them my father, and then she was just too busy. She was too busy taking care of the kids, cooking, cleaning, doing everything that she had to do back at that time in Cuba. And so the story goes that the oud hung from a nail on the wall, but she didn't play it anymore, but the oud was still there. So that's why I decided I would keep that the same as in real life, and she doesn't play it anymore, but there's this memory of her being young and playing the oud. So yeah, so that's why I decided, and that's what you see on the cover of the book. You see the young girl like looking out to the ocean and the sunrise, and has an oud in her hand. So if you can see the cover of the book, I'll show it to you up here again. You can see that she's got that oud in her hand.
I will say to everyone, we do have copies of the book that are still here at the JCC for sale. So if you don't have a copy yet and you want one, go tell your grown-up you want one, and we'll sell it to you.
Andy, you had a question?
What do you want people to take away from this book?
Nice question. Well, a lot of things. I actually have a lot of things on my PowerPoint. I didn't want to go there, but I do have some closing questions as well. But well, I'd like readers to think about history and heritage and like who our ancestors are and where do we come from. I think that's really important. And since it's historical fiction, I think to think about how do we tell stories about the past and the present? How do we connect past and present to each other? Let me see, what else do I have here? I have some notes. Yeah, and I think just thinking about what was it like to be a young person at different moments in history, like to think about like now when you think about 1492, now you'll think about it a little differently, right? Because you'll know that 1492 isn't just associated with Columbus coming to the Americas, but also the surrender of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews. So now you have a broader sense of 1492. I think that's really important. And to just think about the role that young people play in history in different periods of history. I think that's important. And if you didn't know much about Sephardic Jews, to also have gained some new knowledge of the Sephardim and who they are and like the different journeys that they've taken, that was another very important goal for me too.
One second. So yeah, it looks like we've got a question from someone at Bethel, and Anna Klein also has a question. So we're gonna go Bethel first and then Anna. So Bethel, think about, yeah.
Hi, sorry about that. So yeah, I just kind of like a teacher question for our class. How did your experiences inform your decision to pursue anthropology specifically, as opposed to like a similar like course of studies, like sociology, or religious studies, archaeology, something like that?
Yeah, so I'm specifically a cultural anthropologist. So I don't dig as archaeologists do. I don't look at the very distant past, but I am interested in material artifacts and how they connect to our stories. Um, I got very interested in anthropology, I think because I was interested in different cultures. I was interested in different languages. I had grown up, in this with this identity that seemed very strange to people. People always said, "How could you be Jewish and Cuban?" I always had to explain that I was both, and had to give my family history. Well, my grandparents found their way to Cuba in the 20s because they couldn't come to the United States. The United States actually had a very tight quota system in the 1920s, so it was very hard to immigrate to the US from Southern and Eastern Europe where they were from. And so they went to Cuba at the time and became basically Cubans. And then we left because of the revolution and restarted our lives in the US. So I think thinking about immigration, diaspora, different cultures, different languages, why is that important to people? I think all of those issues really interested me, but I was also very interested in creative writing, and I kind of started out interested in poetry and playwriting and fiction. Those were kind of my early interests. But then I found anthropology, and I really wanted to live in different parts of the world where Spanish is spoken because I really love the language. And that's really what led me to anthropology. I love the concept of field work, for that, in case that's new to many of you, where you go and immerse yourself in a different culture, in a different place for a year or two or more, and really get to know the people in the place. I was just so fascinated by that, and that's what led me into anthropology. And I spent years living in Spain, then in Mexico, and then going back and forth to Cuba. So I love that whole experience of immersing yourself in a different culture and getting to know people, total strangers that you get to know who come to trust you and tell you their stories. I thought that was such an amazing thing about anthropology. So that's why I started there, but I never lost my interest in storytelling and poetry and fiction. And so I was always thinking about that and writing poems, along with doing my anthropology. And then recently, about 10 years ago, started writing books for kids, which has been great. I've really loved this new part of my life.
Great. Looks like we've got a question from Anna and Deborah, and that might be all the time that we have. So we've got some grown-ups with questions. We'll give them a little bit of time.
My
Anna,
turn. My turn. So being born in Poland, I was wondering if you also plan to write a book about your Polish ancestors.
Yeah, well, I wrote the book Letters from Cuba, which is sitting here, Letters from Cuba. And so this book is about my Polish Jewish grandmother. It's inspired by the story of my Polish Jewish grandmother. So it actually starts in Poland with she writing a letter from Govorowo, writing a letter from the town of Govorowo to her father, who is already in Cuba, and she's begging him to let her be the first of all the children to go to Cuba, even though she's a girl. He wants one of the sons to come, and she says, "But I'm the oldest, and even though I'm a girl, you have to let me be first, and I will help you bring the rest of the family from Poland to Cuba." So that's where I address that Polish part of my history. I don't have the whole story isn't set in Poland, but I've been to Govorowo, I've been to Poland to see where she was from. And so there is that, there's a little bit of the Polish culture there at the beginning of the book. And then the family well, shouldn't give it away. Most of the family reunites at the end of the book in Cuba.
Thank you.
and Deborah will be our last question.
Okay. I've heard that in Spain they have traditionally served a lot of pork at meals. I know that when we went there with our son who was vegetarian, he had trouble finding anything not meat, but particularly there was a lot of pork and all the hams hanging over from the ceiling. And I've heard that was deliberate in the time they were throwing out the Muslims and the Jews because those would be abhorrent to both groups. Is that true? That it was a deliberate decision?
It is true, and in fact, the people who stayed, the Jews who converted and the Muslims who converted too, because they were both kinds of converts, they would often, well, they would do two things. They would often hang, pork or hams from their like kitchen windows, so it looked like they were, following the rules.
Mhm.
But you could also get reported to the Inquisition if you refused to eat ham or pork for whatever reason. And then also if you were seen bathing on Friday night or wearing white clothes on Friday night, suggesting that you were secretly celebrating Shabbat, those kinds of things could also get you into trouble. And it is interesting that indeed, I mean, I've traveled to Spain so many times that pork is just such a big part of the diet, and there are all those bars with everything the pork, sausages and so on hanging. And in the village where I lived, they raised pigs and they made sausages there as well, and I was living there in this community, and I absolutely had to eat some of it because I would have insulted my hosts who had made their own sausages from their own pigs. So I had to taste taste what they made, just not to totally insult them. But now in recent years, I'm pretty much a vegetarian, or pescatarian, I guess, at this point. So I don't eat anything really but vegetables most of the time. And now in Spain, there's much more of an understanding of different diets, and you can find many vegetarian and vegan restaurants, especially Madrid, but other places, Granada and Barcelona and other places as well. So I think that has changed quite a lot in recent years, but that tradition is still there, definitely in many communities.
I just didn't believe it was true, but thank you. Always wondered.
So much for your time. I hope that the kiddos here who have heard about your book are feeling inspired to either write their own book or travel to some of the places that you have talked about, and just are feeling connected to their identity in a way, in an international way that they maybe hadn't before. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone else for participating today as we zoomed in from all across the triangle. And we hope to do this again next year.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to be here and to talk to all the students. Thank you for all your questions. It was really lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a wrap, everybody.
Stop.
I want to go my backpack.